point you to the repo for the course, because that's probably the best way to start, I think.
Sure.
So
just so everyone knows what we're talking about, since we just went live, this is the April 28th IPython Jupyter Dev meeting, and Matthew Brett is going to give us a little bit of his recent experiences with interfacing notebooks into Sphinx-based documentation for some course materials he's been building here at Berkeley. Go for it, Matthew.
Okay. So I think probably the best thing would be to start with what actually happened. So I'm currently on day 10 of this course.
Okay.
So teaching 2 hours every week, and it's a flipped classroom. So I give the students about maybe half an hour to 3/4 of an hour of homework of various sorts. And everything that they've done, more or less, with sort of maybe about half an hour exception, has been in the notebooks. So the reading is in various formats, but is most often a tutorial of some sort that I have written. And the class is a combination. Is me presenting out of notebooks, sort of usually some introduction to the stuff that they'll need for the exercises, but sometimes some more substantial piece of science, and then they work in the notebooks. So that's just really to orient you to the fact that I'm using the notebooks a lot. I use them all the time, and also then to say what I've found difficult about it, because I've found a kind of quite considerable friction in trying to write stuff in the notebooks. So what you'll see, I think, is that. So I'm going to point you to one particular day. Yes, computers are tough. So you will see on this day where I was talking about convolution.
Day 5.
And I posted the actual notebook, sorry, the actual tutorial. And so I have the usual sort of setup with the class websites in Sphinx. And what I found myself doing is being stuck right in the. Sorry, carry on.
The tutorial on convolution is this one that I just posted the link to, the one that says onconvolution.html.
Yeah, I posted it just.
And that looks converted from a notebook. Is that correct or not?
No. So that's the interesting thing.
Really?
I am frequently stuck right in the middle between the notebook and Sphinx. So this was almost exclusively written in Sphinx.
Okay.
And so what I found myself doing is constantly using the plot directive. But I mean, it's extremely frustrating. So it's really unpleasant to debug in the plot directive. So
yeah. No kidding. That's for sure.
Yeah. So luckily, I write code which is almost completely free of bugs, as I think you all know. But in the very rare cases where I do have bugs, it's exceptionally annoying, and it's also very slow. It's a very slow build process once you get to a substantial number of cells with the plot directive.
I don't think the plot directive has any smart caching or anything, right?
No.
Yeah. So you end up rerunning, and if any of your cells happens to be somewhat CPU intensive, you have to wait for it to complete.
Yeah. So for example, the build step for this this website is quite. I mean, I think it's about sort of 10 seconds now. No, maybe about 20 seconds, where it's building all of the plot directives. So this whole thing, which as you say looks like a converted notebook, I wrote this whole thing exclusively in Sphinx.
Okay.
And then I'm going to put you to the next one, which is on slice timing. if you look at that next one, this was half written in Sphinx and half in the notebook.
Okay.
And so what I found myself doing was sort of writing it in Sphinx, and I literally wrote a converter to convert the plot directives into a notebook in order to debug. So I've got somewhere in the same repo a sort of a tiny little script which takes out the plot directives, takes out the code from the plot directives, and makes them into IPython notebook cells.
So hold on, you were converting them into a notebook, but the page itself is coming from the Sphinx sources, so you would debug in the notebook, and then once you got it working, you would copy back that cell block back into your restructured text file.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you a very concrete question. Are there any pages in this repo where the actual restructured text of the page itself was emitted from an IPyNB file, where you have an individual page where you actually wrote it as a notebook and you simply emitted RST and let Sphinx do the build?
No.
No. Okay.
And to be honest, since I last investigated that, which was about a year and a half ago, I have not since looked to see what a MB convert build of a REST page looks like.
Okay.
But I mean, so as you remember, because I use the notebook so much, I have written an extension which will embed notebook HTML inside your Sphinx pages. And I don't know whether you remember that one, but
no.
So here is an example. Okay. Here's an example of the output, and
okay, that's a notebook embedded straight into a Sphinx document.
Yeah.
Okay.
And is that using NB convert to HTML and then using Sphinx raw HTML?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I can't remember where I got it from now, but I picked up some code which does some awful surgery on the output HTML in order to make it not clash with the Sphinx CSS.
Yeah, so rather than going notebook to REST to HTML, it's going notebook to HTML,
Yeah.
and then just plopping the HTML in Sphinx with an raw HTML directive.
What's the status of our direct REST output?
It's pretty sparse.
Okay.
So it's to REST, not to Sphinx.
Okay.
So it doesn't do much.
Possibly we should have a subclass that does to Sphinx.
Which we used to have, and then we removed.
Smooth.
I think partly because a lot of the Sphinx was actually for making like books, and the Sphinx you should emit is different depending on what you're doing.
Okay.
So I mean, yeah. So those are the. So I'm having two problems, I guess. So the first is that when I'm writing substantial text, where I really have to think about what I'm doing, I find it very hard to write in the notebook.
What specifically are the pain points?
Well, I mean, I think this is a discussion that we've had around the table in Lucky House, but I find it very. When I'm using the notebook, I mean, the reason this came up partly was because the comment that the Rodeo developer said that they found the notebook kind of heavy, and that's my experience too. That when I'm in the notebook, I feel sort of constantly uncomfortable. That I'm sort of not in my native environment. So some proportion of my CPU cycles is going to sort of I'm using the notebook now, and the reason that I go to such extraordinary trouble to use plot directive instead is that I can switch to my editor, and I find it much easier to think when I'm using my editor, moving text around in the way that I'm familiar with. And of course, when you're trying to write a sort of substantial piece of sort of tutorial text, you have to think really hard to get it right. So I'm finding when I'm using the notebook, I'm finding it harder to think. It is getting better slowly. And times the things which the notebook can do are so compelling that I can't I have to write it in the notebook. So in fact, if anything, I'm sort of moving towards using the notebook more often. So the last two really big tutorials I wrote are entirely in notebook form.
It would be good to understand more specifically what the usability problems are that are causing this friction when using the notebook. I mean,
to what extent? This is a serious question. I'm not trying to insult you. To what extent is that? Do you think that is usability problems in the notebook, and to what extent do you think that is just what you're familiar with?
Well, so this was the discussion we were having in Lucky House. I think, I mean, it is possible that Vim users suffer particularly from this, but
I
yeah.
would expect the notebook to have a harder time capturing advanced Vim and Emacs users.
Yeah,
in general.
I totally agree. That helps me to yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So I mean, when I'm writing anything, I find that when I'm using my normal setup, I've completely forgotten about the tools that I'm using. I'm just thinking, and in the notebook I can't do that. It's constantly tripping me up. Now, there are things that I can do in the notebook which are sort of enormously valuable, which make it far easier to write stuff in than Sphinx and the plot directive. I mean, some of the obvious ones, but also the fact that I can see LaTeX markup rendered really quickly. The fact that it'll output the notebook directive is particularly bad for putting sort of output from Python print commands and so on, which I frequently want. So at the moment, neither of the two are sort of satisfactory, and I really want something that is in between. And the other thing, of course, when writing stuff is you frequently want to rearrange text. You start writing something and you sort of reconsider it and realize it wants to be done the other way around, and that is a very annoying thing to do in the notebook, as you all know.
So I think if I'm listening correctly to you, Matthew, would you agree that there's probably kind of three slightly independent areas that present issues? One is kind of the natural fluidity of your own native text editor and how good the Vim key bindings are in the notebook for Vim users. I don't know if they're good enough or not, and the fact that they're not super easy to configure. You have to add a little bit of JavaScript. I don't know, for example, have you tried, do you have your notebook configured with Vim key bindings or not?
No, because you've got this sort of double modal thing, right? So there's the Control M modal thing, and then there's the Vim modal thing, and if they just clash so badly that I basically have to sort of get my brain to turn off my Vim thing.
Wow.
So Paul wrote a plugin called Vimception, which deals with precisely this. I mean, it's called that because it has 3 levels. So you go from IPython command mode to Vim command mode to Vim edit mode.
Yeah, but I mean, the whole thing about Vim is that you just can't afford to sort of do anything other than exactly what you do in Vim.
Yeah.
I mean, the system which you're using in Vim is a very stupid one. It's some very small number of nerves are involved in generating the key press. And you basically just have to turn off your whole sort of Vim sort of system in order to use anything that isn't exactly your own Vim. I mean, it kind of works for the Vim terminal bindings, but even then, almost every Vim user has got a whole sort of Vim setup, which is their own Vim setup, and that's the only setup they're comfortable in.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to match that level of customization with a system that has kind of its own UI around it. And Vim was really designed to say when you're inside Vim, it controls and it defines your workflow, and you can wire your muscle memory very, very deeply into it. And that's great when you're inside of it. It makes it extraordinarily difficult to kind of integrate with other systems. So, okay, so one is kind of the Vim key bindings, muscle memory, workflow model of Vim versus anything else, pretty much. That's kind of.
Well, I think the same is true for a highly customized Emacs, no?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah. For basically extremely precisely customized editors that are heavily reliant on key bindings and on muscle memory and very rapid switches of workflow. I mean, look, I recently switched to a Mac, and for For the most part, I'm reasonably happy. But key bindings and the default key bindings are still tripping me every single day and still driving me crazy because so much of that muscle memory was so deeply embedded in me that I'm totally. I think it's a completely fair point. It's a completely valid point. I also think it's a point that is very difficult to address. I don't have any good ideas.
Well, see, I was talking to so anyway. So there's the Vim key bindings.
Yeah, there's the Vim key bindings. The second one is the conversion to from notebook from editing notebooks into Sphinx, and there I think it's probably worth looking. Let me send you guys a couple of links. This is, I remembered that so that's an example from the YT documentation, and if you look at the YT documentation, they actually have, that's a rendered example. It's obvious that it's a notebook, and here's what you get. This is their Bitbucket repo, their source repo for YT, and so you can see in the sources, and this is one directory in their sources. I already looked. The make file is a standard Sphinx make file, so it is Sphinx, and they do exactly what I was mentioning, right? They have, if you look in that directory, they have a bunch of .py files. They have some handwritten RSTs, but they also have files where you can obviously see, because both are committed next to each other, the IPyNB next to the RST, right? So YT is doing this. So the tool chain for that.
So I think I copied. I think it was their code I copied. But
yeah, but they've obviously been kind of refining it, and they continue to work on it. And
now, and there's also looks like it's to HTML, not to restructured text.
And they're just, okay.
But it might be an RST file that just has an HTML directive.
Let's have a look.
But
so where is their code? Yeah, extensions. Notebook Sphinx. Yeah, I don't know how much they've changed it.
Oh no! Look, they have a interesting. I mean, we'd have to. I don't think that we want to explore the full details of their toolchain right here. But look at the RST file. They have a notebook directive period. Notebook.
They're doing exactly the same thing as me.
Okay.
I mean, because I copied their stuff.
Ah, okay, and they haven't updated that. Okay.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how much they've updated it, but it looks very similar to what I remember what I've been using. So I pointed you to my version of Notebook Sphinx X, but I clearly copied it from them.
From theirs. Okay. And in the conversation, I lost track of what the third point was. I remember thinking that you were kind of highlighting roughly three somewhat independent sets of issues. One was kind of the workflow in the editor. The other one was the document conversion integration. I forgot what the third one was.
So I think that's certainly true, that the sort of publishing aspect is a real sticky point. So it's very, for example, now when I do, even though I've got my own website which uses this system, I don't like it at all. And so I will, in fact, publish the tutorial notebooks as notebooks in the code site that the students use, instead of putting it into the main website for that reason. So I was going to comment. I was just actually had coffee with Paul this morning. You may remember Paul.
We do, fondly.
Yes.
Yeah. And we miss him.
Yeah.
So we were talking about. We were talking about what the right system would look like, and luckily we worked that out.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Does it look a lot like Vim?
It does.
Yeah, exactly.
Identical. So Paul was talking about his design for. So what was that called? Vim IPython, which I couldn't use. And it seemed to us that some system which would allow you to write in Vim, where you define the cells with some sort of tiny markup, like percent markdown or percent Python or whatever. So those markers would delineate cells, and then you would have some key binding which would send whichever cell you were in to a IPython kernel, and therefore into a notebook. So you have
into a kernel and therefore into a notebook is a huge leap because there's currently no connection from the kernel to the notebook.
Yeah, they're very completely
There's a
different.
connection from the notebook to the kernel, but there's nothing the other. There's no connection the other way around.
Okay, so so let's say I did have some text and I wanted it rendered in a notebook, which was in a window next to me.
A notebook in the browser?
Yeah. So well, it's not necessary that the rendered stuff appears in Vim,
Right.
but it is necessary that I should be able to fluidly send stuff from Vim to the notebook.
Are you sending across individual cells, or would the entire file kind of be synchronized between Vim and the notebook?
No, I'm sending across individual cells. So I'm using the notebook as a render engine for the individual cells. So I might want to execute the entire notebook at some point, but my main workflow would be I have finished writing some markdown with LaTeX in it. Can I see what that looks like? Or, I finished writing a plot. Can I
wonder if a teeny bit of JavaScript using what Cyril Rosson created recently, IPyMD. So let me look it up.
The problem is how do you map cells between the browser UI and Vim? You have to have some sort of UID, otherwise you have to rerun everything each time.
Well,
if you edit a cell and then send it to the notebook again, does it just get appended as a new cell, or does it try to replace the previous time that you copied that cell?
We thought we'd have different key bindings for those two situations.
Appending at the end is not that difficult because already the kernel publish messages and the notebook does not react yet to messages that are not emanating from itself. But actually replacing a cell would need that you have to know or to keep track in Vim to which cells correspond to what in the notebook.
But if you're doing it one cell at a time, you can just use the cursor, right?
Yeah, you can just...
So if you're saying replace current cell with my buffer, you replace the current cell with my buffer. Current cell.
I mean that if you move in VI to another cell, you have to switch to the browser and change the cell.
Yeah, but if you're only doing one cell at a time in VI, then that's not an issue.
Yeah, so I don't care about the sort of consistency of the notebook that is generated on the right-hand side of my screen.
Okay.
It's just a render buffer.
Or you really don't. You're really not thinking of...
So I'm imagining the thing which is in the left, which is my Vim screen, that is the source, which I may build into a notebook or a Sphinx extension, a Sphinx page or whatever. But the right-hand stuff is just rendering the source. It's like sort of building a PDF from a LaTeX document. It's just I'm just trying to see
whether you got it right.
Yeah, because that's what I use it for.
So you don't actually need a notebook UI. You just need something that display your current VI plot.
Yeah.
So so basically, if you could just get a Vim, if you get your actual Vim to edit cells.
Yeah.
Like Emacs IPython notebook, but with Vim.
Well, so Emacs IPython notebook is for editing and authoring whole notebooks, but there are, and you don't use a browser. But you're talking about there being a browser active and involved.
Yeah. So I mean
that's talking really Vim talking directly to the browser is what you want, rather than Vim talking to the kernel.
Well, I mean, the easy way of doing this would be to run Vim in the web-based terminal in a phosphor pane next to the notebooky UI render thing that you want. Then you have full real Vim, but integrated with the same UI that the notebook is sitting in.
I don't think that makes it any easier than just having Vim in your regular terminal emulator. You still need some method for
communicating with
it.
What I'm thinking is Brian, not what the direction you just went, but actually I'm thinking of single cell. I'm thinking of a little custom. Imagine a little custom guy that is a slightly customized version of Min's single cell example, where that uses the Vim IPython kernel integration stuff that Paul has written, and that effectively just keeps sending that one block. It's a custom server, so it can know, right, that there is, that one doesn't have to have the separation of communication that we enforce between whether a kernel knows that there is a notebook or not. That kernel can perfectly well know. I mean, that application can perfectly well know that it has a kernel that is talking to a page, and every time it gets a block, it puts it on the page and it renders it. And so you could imagine basically Matthew opens up his Vim session and opens up types a little Vim command that actually starts this little application, starts a kernel connected to that Vim session, and puts it on port 9999. He can open it on his browser, and he basically has a one cell render area, right, where he can just keep it on the side of his screen and keep working in Vim, and every time he hits a command, that cell gets updated and rendered. It's just one cell, but it's a complete, I think that's a perfect use case for a single cell, rather than trying to shoehorn this for the specific thing that Matthew is asking about, which is the individual render. I would do this with single cell, and you might even have single cell actually with two cells, a code cell and a markdown area, in case you also want to use it to do render of markdown boundaries. Matthew, do you think that would, because you were specifically saying, and now I did remember what the third point was. The third point was, I remembered by seeing Jason Grout's comments on Gitter, which was the structural management of notebook files, the difficulty of doing more complex operations at the whole file level, like moving big pieces of content around, merging and whatnot, larger. The fact that we have such primitive multi-cell operations.
Yeah.
I think that's the third. In my mind, those are the three really critical usability issues that I think you're pointing at. Is that a fair assessment, Matthew?
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, the fact that it's you feel out of your normal authoring mode.
Yeah. Well, but in a different way. The first one was you feel out from your normal authoring mode in terms of your kind of muscle memory and workflow at the detail editing level. The second one is that now you have an entire document, and handling that entire document is a kind of a miserable process right now. I mean, and we all admit that. And actually, Paul is the only one who has built something that helps in that direction, but we've never completely kind of cleanly integrated that into the UI. And structural operations are just miserable right now.
Yep. I mean, there's sort of a spectrum of different models going from the like a terminal-based console on one end all the way up to the notebook on the other hand. There's in between areas like a Qt console type experience that's more console-based but has inline output. The next variant towards the notebook would, or well, I don't know which direction, would be a Qt console like input area, but have output rendered in a separate pane, but still have the input be very terminal driven, like where you type something and press go. The other option is one more, I think, is where you're talking, is where the terminal input area is replaced by just a big text area. It could be Vim or it could be something else.
Yeah, it could be
and
anything.
then have a separate render area for the output. And I think it would be great for us to start to figure out the abstractions to allow these different variants of input and output to be more easily expressed. And
yeah.
I mean, because we already have input and output are separate entities, and their location is their relationship. I mean, a cell has an output area. It doesn't require that output area be where it is. It's just there is an object that understands output.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
Matthew,
the layout is already not. There's only one implementation of the layout.
right. But
The layout is already decoupled in the way that you're describing.
yeah.
Have you looked at NitPy?
No, I guess that's a sort of knitter for Python. Sounds like it would be.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty recent. Yeah, I posted both in both chats. Basically, what you want is a live version of NitPy where The only thing would be that your editing area would be Vim instead of being.
I mean, the liveness is really important.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what makes the notebook such a pleasure to use.
So Matthew, I honestly think it might be worth it because both you and Paul are experts in VI, and because Paul does know the architecture so well. If you guys, if you want to turn one of your morning coffee session into a little tryout of hacking on top of the single cell PY example, do you know what I'm talking about, by the way?
No.
Min, are you going to beat me to the URL?
I don't know what the URL is. It's probably minrk/single cell.
Yeah, it is, but I have to type github.com, and I have to type / and I have to type all kinds of things. Okay, Min, fine. I beat you to it. There you go. So it's, Matthew, what single cell does is it gives you a little single cell. It's inspired by Jason's Grout and the Sage guys' work on the Sage single cell server. It gives you a little one cell web. It's a custom little web app that has only one cell. It's not a notebook. It's just it's to show that you can use the protocol and even the JavaScript classes for IPython in something that doesn't look like a notebook, that has a completely different look and feel, right? And so you could imagine that single cell guy simply wired to Paul's Vim integration. This is probably, for you and Paul, well, for Paul, who knows that stuff so well, this is probably a morning coffee hack. And I would at least give it a try and let us know what happens. I would be very interested in hearing if that goes anywhere, because it seems like it would give you what you're talking about without trying to hack into the much more complex. I mean, there's lots of places where I think we're trying to push people away from the notebook, in the sense of saying sometimes rather than beating a square peg into a round hole, it's easier to forget about the notebook and think about the underlying pieces that we provide, which are protocols and communication entities and JavaScript libraries that can do the individual parts, and you just recompose those pieces in a different way. And if that goes anywhere, what I've been thinking about is that as we move over to Phosphor and we now have our full-page terminal and we have our text editor and we have our notebook and we also have, hopefully before too long, we will have some flavor of a web embeddable console that we can put on the page. Then you can imagine basically composing what you're talking about actually in the well, it's a bad idea to call it the notebook in our desktop, in our workbench, whatever we want to call it, where you could say, oh, for this kind of workflow, I'm not going to be using the notebook. Give me either the terminal widget because I want to use raw Vim, or for non-Vim users, give me the embedded text editor instead, and then give me the render area right here on the right just for that input, and just let me work that way, which is a little bit the kind of flavor that Rodeo offers. And I mean, I'm very happy that they did it, but we've been thinking about this kind of stuff already for a while. So I think if you play with that, it would be a very valuable experiment, and we could hack a little bit on that. Well, the royal we. I'm not around, as you know, but
well, I think the royal we is meant to include you normally. it means you're doing the work of many people, but I don't think that's what you mean.
So I don't know if you guys want to think about that. Something tells me it could be very, very useful, and we could learn quite a bit.
Well, I mean, so my feeling is that, I mean, I guess having seen Rodeo, that there is a sort of configuration which could make this into a sort of definitively awesome way of writing stuff.
Yeah, and
it's
and
so
I think,
close. But,
I think we have all the pieces almost there, and that's why I'm encouraging you. And also, I think the key point here is to forget about the notebook for a minute.
Yeah. Think about the architecture underneath the notebook. Forget
about the notebook for a minute and think about the pieces that are underneath. Single cell exposes them best, and as soon as we get out from the huge construction effort we're in, I think we really need to kind of update single cell and promote it into a first-class citizen that we advertise a little bit better, because I think illustrating those ideas is going to be very important.
Yeah, and Single cell doesn't work for IPython greater than 2. So
I know. I keep a Python 2, an IPython 2 environment lying around just so I can demonstrate single cell. Folks, I'm going to have to bail out. I have another meeting right now. So Matthew, thank you so much.
That's okay.
All right.
thanks.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
So, will you be at Bids later, Monday?
Nope,
Okay,
it went
never
away.
mind.
Maybe.
We'll find out. Yeah.
So we have some other items on the agenda. Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
you're welcome to stick around, or if you have other work to do, we would totally understand if you get it.
I'm going. I understand.
Was I polite enough?
Yeah, it was close. But I think very, very minimal. Well done. Okay, good luck. Bye.
All right.
Yep. All right. Issues with atomic saving and Windows permissions and Dropbox and other insanity.
Yeah, so we implemented atomic saving because someone had managed to fill up their swap space and then fill up their hard drive, and then the notebook tried to autosave and failed halfway through, which left them with an incomplete notebook. Shouldn't the checkpoint still have been valid? I don't know. Anyway, so we implemented atomic save because that's a horrible situation to be in, and we didn't want anyone to ever be in it. Unfortunately, operating systems, as far as I know, do not natively provide atomic, write this entire file.
So I have a question. How does our atomic save implementation work right now?
So it saves to a temporary file in the same directory. It has to be in the same directory because this only works if it's on the same file system, and I don't know of a good way to guarantee that except put it in the same directory. It saves to a temporary file, and when that write has succeeded and it has closed the file, then it moves that file to replace the one that you're actually trying to write to.
And how are those temporary files named?
At the moment, they are just named with the automatic suffix from Python's temp file module, which I think is a string of random numbers. I have a pull request.
Prefixed by the notebook name?
Yes.
Okay, I've actually I've seen in my Jupyter Hub deployment some extremely bizarre failures of the atomic saving on an NFS file system.
That's kind of the issue on the things like NFS file systems. I don't use NFS, so I don't really know what's going on there. We had someone who was having problems with Dropbox because, of course, as soon as these temporary files are created, Dropbox starts trying to sync them, and then we rename them a fraction of a second later, which gets it in a horrible mess.
Yeah, that's not generally a problem on places other than Windows, but Windows doesn't let you do things on open files.
What?
Windows.
No, actually, I've learned recently that this is more subtle than that.
Okay.
Windows has exclusive file open mechanisms. I think Python doesn't engage them by default. So, yeah, the stuff you think about Windows files being opened so that only one thing can access them at a time is not necessarily true.
Well, I know it can break if somebody else has opened a file. You can't move it, rename it, delete it, because I know that happens with Conda. That Conda upgrade, which is Python. If you have a Python console open, if Notebook is running and you Conda upgrade, it will actually do a partial upgrade because files that are open will not get replaced.
I've seen that before.
Yeah. So anyway, Dropbox Dropbox was another issue. Matthias found a workaround for that. I suspect that Dropbox will probably be the most common issue. There are certain file name patterns that Dropbox will ignore because some other programs also create temporary files, and
like Microsoft Office.
So
You use the same pattern as Microsoft Office for temporary files.
So yeah, I have a pull request that makes it use, I forget which of the patterns I picked, but one of the patterns that is documented as being ignored by Dropbox, which would presumably make it nicer in that case. We also had someone who, I think it was a Mac user who, like, their work thing had some network drive, and if anything on a Mac attempts to modify the permissions on the file, then it destroys all of the permission data associated with that, which his workplace was not terribly happy about, understandably. I mean, obviously we can make atomic saving configurable and allow users to turn it off, but that seems like a horrible solution because it's not. People are not going to understand what the problem is, so we're going to forever be fielding bug reports saying, well, you can turn this feature off.
Yeah. And yeah, and part of my question is, are the problems we're seeing with atomic saving worse and more widespread than the problems that we faced without having atomic saving?
I think they're more widespread. They're not worse.
Yeah, that was.
What about having a saving which is slightly different, which is creating a temporary file on which we save the notebook once. So we're sure we have at least one copy of the notebook on disk. Write over the original file. Delete the temporary file. It's not atomic saving, but we don't try to move file around, but we are at least sure that you have one copy of notebook on disk. You still write twice.
Something. I mean, we could put something in the IPython checkpoints folder, but a pre-actual save checkpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do any of you have any ideas about how this would show up on NFS file systems? I just don't know enough about NFS to really...
No, I can't think of a way for this to fail on NFS.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess, so just a question, where you have seen, when you say that you've seen this fail, do you mean you've seen temporary files lying around, or you've seen actual error messages?
Both.
And can you remember any of the error messages?
I've been trying to save log files when I see things. I can probably look for
that would be helpful, because I think from some of the reports, there may be some interactions with permissions.
With what?
With permissions. That autosave, I think, might misbehave if the user can't write to the file. That they might be able to write the autosave that they might be able to write the temporary file, but not replace the real file if they don't. Do you know what I mean? That if the notebook is read-only, but they can still somehow execute a save operation, which they shouldn't be able to do, but maybe they can manage at some point. That it might be related to permissions for you and not NFS.
So if the network goes out at different steps in the file saving aspect, so when it creates the temporary file, and then when it was going to move over, the network issue happens, that wasn't able to like replace the original file. Like, would that be something that would happen on NFS?
But the move should fail. Well, and NFS has, you can configure NFS to be varying degrees of lazy, right? So if NFS is kind of doing some amount of lazy evaluation of moves, then you can have local file system operations that succeed, but that fail to be applied to the remote file system and then get undone at some point in the future. I would really doubt that that's what's going on, though. I would, because you, Brian, you provide notebooks to users that you own, right? That they can't edit?
No.
No? Okay.
No, all the notebooks that are owned by the users.
I would be really surprised if NFS is actually involved, but it's definitely possible. There are, it's technically possible for network things to cause weird behaviors on NFS, but I would be really surprised if that's ever actually happening.
Okay. Yeah, I'm browsing log files right now.
The alternative is to deactivate atomic file writing, like the case where a user actually had full drive. It's pretty rare. Just roll back everything.
I mean, obviously, I don't see how we can ever detect all or even a sufficient fraction of the cases where it could be a problem.
So, I guess I have one question. Do we currently detect extended attributes and make sure that they get propagated? Because Dropbox uses extended attributes both on Linux and on Windows in a different way.
Is that the same thing as CH flags?
Well, that's like adder and yeah. I mean, you put arbitrary
we copy across whatever CH flags does, I think, to the new files.
And that's one of the things that crashes macOS network drive, where when you try to copy the permission and the extended attribute from the original file to the one we are doing atomic save on, it basically destroys all the permissions.
But yeah, there's permissions, and then there is also
permissions and flag. Those are not the same thing.
Yeah.
Matthias.
Yeah, but I think we do both of these operations just destroy the thing on remote drive on macOS, so we shouldn't try to do anything.
But we definitely, those are, because we definitely, so if we're doing it the way we're doing it, where we're writing a new file and then copying it, we have to write the permissions, because otherwise, otherwise every save resets permissions to the system default. So we have to do it. The only way to not do that let's see. The only way to not do that would be to do it the other way around, rather than write temporary and move temporary on success. You copy the known good version and then write to the real file, and then
delete
at the end. Delete known good if on success. Delete known good, or delete backup on failure. Move known backup. Move backup into the original location. That is much more susceptible to losing data than what we do now, but it would mean that we're doing regular file writes so that we don't have to copy permissions or anything.
Yeah.
But that doesn't prevent Dropbox from grabbing trying to sync the file and
But if it's an
preventing
ignored
us.
file name, that's not an issue, right?
Yeah, for Dropbox, but it won't be for every.
Yeah, I couldn't find, for instance, anything equivalent to those ignored patterns for Google Drive. It may be that it has some. I don't know. I can't test.
Yeah, and we can play around with them. I don't think that's a huge deal though.
I mean, we could also, rather than it being a temporary file, we could, as we currently do, a checkpoint when the user explicitly presses save. We could also have a checkpoint that is a copy of the file just before the file is overwritten. So it would go in the IPython checkpoints folder with a slightly different name.
So using the checkpoint mechanism, we would say create checkpoint.
Yeah, this is
last good save.
This is presumably something that's only relevant for the file contents manager. I mean, if you're storing this in a database, I assume none of this is relevant, because databases
have whole transactions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can someone just write us a cross-platform transactional file system?
We could just replace, get rid of notebook directory, get rid of file contents manager entirely, and just say all your notebooks are in a database. Version control that.
Well, then we just have to implement Git on top of that database.
No, you just expose the database as a file user in user space, file system in user space. Postgres
this should work if we just use HDF5 for the whole thing. Then HDF5 basically is a transactional parallel read-write file system as one file.
That sounds right for going after Spark.
So yeah, does the checkpoint mechanism work?
Yeah, maybe it shouldn't actually be the checkpoint mechanism. I was just thinking of that as kind of like there's already a directory we use that we can put copies of notebooks in, and it's kind of out of the way a bit. I'm generally against having extra things cluttering up my home directory.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it seems clear that if we're using temporary files, we should pick something that Dropbox will ignore. But overwriting files is a frustrating process on Windows because it doesn't work like everybody else. Yeah, I really don't know what. We can investigate doing the temporary files the other way around. It's a lot more complicated to do it that way, but it might be better. People know what I mean when I say that.
What do you mean the other way around?
So where the temporary file is the temporary file is a backup of the good save, rather than so right now we are writing to a temporary file and on success moving that into place.
Yep.
We could the other way to do the same basic structure of you copy the good file to a backup, and then you write to the real file, and on failure you move the backup into place, and on success you delete the backup. The disadvantage of that approach is that if the recovery operation also fails, like if the computer dies, then you've got an autosave. You've got two files. You've got the real file, which may or may not be good, and you've got an autosave backup. which is definitely good, but might be obsolete, and it's hard to actually recover from that.
Yeah,
I mean, we could have mechanisms that do. I mean, I think this is something similar to what OpenOffice has with the document recovery. Do like if the notebook is not intact, then look for its backup file. Like if it's not valid JSON, then
well, I think you need to take action if the backup file exists.
Yeah, or that, depending on whether you're doing the backup file, depending on whether you remove it on successful save or leave it as a. I mean, I think the way some editors do backup files is that it's, there's always a copy sitting there with a tilde suffix or something.
Yeah,
That's kind of my checkpoint suggestion is that the last successful save of any kind would be a.
Yeah, I mean it's functionally it's the same as writing the file next to it. It's just putting it in the checkpoints folder.
Yeah.
But it's the same kind of sequence of events.
Yeah, I was just thinking if it's a file that you leave rather than deleting on successful save, then I prefer to have it in a hidden directory.
Yeah, I don't think we should have extra files laying around in people's actual directories. That's not.
Okay, then I don't know. I mean, do you want to try giving that a go?
I really don't know. I don't know. It all sounds.
Rush to implement it at once, will you?
It all sounds horrible.
We could just check, if the disk don't run, if the disk has less than a gig free.
But then someone will manage to embed a video or something and end up with a 1.2 gigabyte notebook.
Don't save it if you will lose power in 200 milliseconds.
IPython is now only supported on computers with UPS.
Jesus.
I really don't know.
Can we let that a bit of rest and move forward and came back to that later?
Yeah.
We don't need for half an hour, 45 minutes.
That's the best suggestion I've heard.
Yeah. Kyle, Docker, yay.
Cool. So I wrote this before I switched it, but so try.jupyter.org images are switched to using Conda, which made them 2-point-something gigabytes down from 4-point-something gigabytes. And it's only Python 3, R, and Julia right now. Okay, that was shift. And then people have been asking about adding other kernels. Like we got a request to add in iHaskell, which added another 2 gigabytes to the image. On one hand, I'd like to support every kernel possible so that people could try them. The other direction, it makes it a lot. It makes the image itself that it runs on much bigger, and sometimes the build time much longer to finish up. Now that we're using Conda,
imagine I have installed iHaskell on my computer before, and it took 40 minutes or something.
Yeah. So and installs it straight from GitHub. It at least seems like a lot of people are using that one, and it has its own little community, and that Andrew's doing good work with it. So I'd be tempted to add it. Out of the list of ones that people have talked about. I mean, it's only 27 kernels, so what, an extra 27 gigabytes or so? It should be okay.
37 kernels. But Quite
yeah.
a lot of them, I think, are wrapper kernels, which
Yeah, which means they're small Python packages.
Oh yeah, and so those ones, it's like the bash kernel. We should just put it in there because it's
Yeah, that's easy.
Um,
So one question. So what is Conda installed for that user only or system-wide?
well, it doesn't matter because they're each in their own Docker container and they have full access to Conda.
Okay, and what Conda packages are you installing ahead of time?
All the basically the SciPy stack and a few others, and then the R kernel plus a few R packages.
Question about complex kernels that couldn't use Conda. Would it be possible to have Docker kernels where basically you run another Docker image outside of the main image, where you mount the home directory in both, or I'm not sure how we would do that, so that basically people could just provide another image that could be a kernel?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean you could wrap it a certain way, right? They like.
but then you need to give the Docker container access to Docker, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, but the outside Docker.
if we ever
No,
wanted
you would need to give the
out.
user's Docker container access to Docker to do that.
Oh, you can run Docker inside Docker inside Docker, right?
Yeah, but then if you're running Docker in Docker, then it needs network access to get.
Well, like we could do a whole bunch of other work to make a setup like that going, but it would be completely awkward. Like we wouldn't have. We could do. I mean, because you'd have to do the inter-container communication.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
And like it sounds clean from a like, oh hey, everybody makes their own kernel, and so they have their own namespace that they work in. But it also means that each of those kernels then has their own file system that's distinct and separate from the others. Right? Because if the kernel's running inside the Docker container, the file system that it's exposing is only the one of that kernel image, right? If that's where you're running the kernel.
Yeah.
Unless you also mount volumes. Like, it becomes a really awkward, like, deployment strategy. It's not bad to have lots of kernels in one image and have a really, really big image, especially because everyone's sharing it. The way that Docker works is that you build up in layers. And so, like on the try.jupyter.org setup, if somebody goes to the site and they get a new image, and another person comes in, they're both using the same 10 gigabytes. They're just layering a diff on top of what was already there, like within their own space. So it's not bad. It's just that the build stuff is a little awkward. Yeah.
Sure.
So I guess the hard part. So what Matthias mentioned was straight out of the issue number 7 on the try setup, which is Weevil posted a like outline for how we could even do kind of like a kernel's process to give people an easy PR process to bring in a new kernel, and maybe even a registry, right? Instead of our current wiki page, it's like you go to this kernel site and it shows you a way to get a kernel. And almost that almost to me is like so far down in the packaging path that I'm a little scared of it. But it would be neat for people to be able to get to it. So I'm interested to see what other people have because I haven't responded yet. And this was commented on 27 days ago.
Yeah, I did. It certainly makes sense from a high level to allow to give kernel authors both control and responsibility for that, but at the same time, I think it makes a lot of stuff a lot more complicated. It makes deployment specifically a lot more complicated, right?
Yeah, and like we'd be at the point of writing our own orchestration tools to make it be at that high level niceness. So
yeah.
No, there was. I don't have any direct questions on that, but it would be nice if people looked at kind of this one.
Yeah, I've been spending some background time thinking about that one, and I don't know. My guess is that probably more. I mean, as tedious and annoying as one big build is, that seems more, at this point anyway, probably easier to maintain than building this abstract interface for kernels that we can deploy with the same boundaries that we have right now.
I mean, one intermediate. I mean, so I think there's two parts of this. One is just the size of the Docker container.
Yeah.
The other is the complexity of having Docker containers that have different combinations of kernels. And I think one idea to solve the second of those problems would be to standardize how a Docker container installs a kernel, and maybe want to just say we'll use Ansible. Provide us an Ansible script that installs your kernel inside that container, and then make it easy for people to assemble new containers that have combinations of different kernels, rather than sort of copying and pasting some particular set of lines between different Docker build files.
So this is actually something that at least Min commented on when we first started working with Docker, which is that we couldn't easily compose different Docker files.
Yeah.
Easily compose different like shell scripts or Ansible setups, but like there's not an easy way to put these together.
Yeah, Docker is entirely linear, isn't it? Like you can compose them so long as it's just a strict sequence of do these instructions, then add these instructions, then add these instructions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The same as just adding the lines. So the nice thing about our current files being like one single long piece is it is an exact, explicit setup that guaranteeably works to install right now the IPython itself, the R kernel, and the Julia kernel. And so on some level, it's a reference implementation for how someone would like set up these kernels. That's like a side
value.
Yeah, and people apparently have like watched that and commented on like using the R kernel through Conda because they saw that like that Docker file was there for the demo images.
Well, but it like at the same time when John and I deployed Jupyter Hub on our cluster, we took all the stuff in your Docker files and made them Ansible scripts. So, it's I don't know. I don't. I mean, it seems like there's.
If you took the stuff from the Docker files were still useful as a reference for how this is done. And I think Docker files, in that sense, are much easier to see what's going on because it is just a series of instructions than with Ansible.
Well, and even if
it's all over the place.
Yeah, and even if you didn't do it with Ansible scripts, if you did it with shell scripts,
sure. No,
you would lose the step-by-step caching in the Docker file. Like it would be caching larger chunks.
Do Docker build files have an include capability?
Well, you can add files. If that's what you're saying, like.
But yeah, so what you would do is you would add. to run a shell script, it's the same as what you were describing with Ansible, but you add a shell script and then you run it. So it lets you basically, as one Docker step, do like install IPython, and as one Docker step, do install R.
Yeah. I'm not particularly attached to Ansible on this, but
yeah. So you could do it in such a way that there's just a collection of files that get run by the Docker file. You do lose a certain amount of caching, but for tempNB itself, the caching's not actually all that useful, right? Because we build infrequently and it starts from 0 every time. Is that right, Kyle?
Yes-ish.
Yeah. So
if the cache is already there, then it won't build the rest of it.
Yeah, and it's annoying when you're working on that because you change one. Like if it's the last step, the nice thing about Docker caching is if you've got a problem at the end of your Docker file, you can fix it, and it will start from when you build it again. It will start from the last step that succeeded. But if, for instance, you have as a single step install the Haskell platform and iHaskell, which takes 40 minutes, and then at the end of that step you have copy this file into that location, and there's a typo in that, the next time you run it, it'll take 40 minutes to fix that typo, or to check if that typo is fixed, which is not the most pleasant development experience.
Yeah. One side note about the deployment. I've been running Jupyter Hub without Docker on a server now for 5 weeks for this class, and after this experience, I'm pretty convinced that in most cases people should not run Jupyter Hub without Docker. I mean, sure, there's cases where it's not too bad, but if any number of people start to use the system, the number of ways that it gets ugly is infinite.
Can you describe? Because I haven't heard about any of those. Can you describe at least one of them?
Yeah, I mean, the classic thing is that someone logs on, does a bunch of work, and forgets to close notebooks, and they sit there, don't consume CPU usage, but when you have a large number of users who are all forgetting their notebooks running, RAM usage goes.
But there's nothing. The Docker doesn't really help you with that, does it?
Can't you RAM limit single-user notebook servers?
Yeah, I suppose you can. I think you can do that with quotas on the system anyway. But yeah.
And so that, obviously you don't always want to do that in Docker, but not being able to do it. I've had situations where a single user was using 50% of the RAM, 0 CPU, and these issues become.
It sounds like the automatic culling is more important than the containers for something like that, though, because you don't want to limit people's memory allocation too much, because getting a memory error in your code is a horrible way to find out that your resources are limited.
Yeah, and ulimit lets you set memory limits for users, so you don't need to. Depending on your deployment environment, you don't need Docker to limit. At least not on Linux, you don't need Docker to limit memory of users.
I guess
or processes or process trees.
The big difference here is that you're either doing it at an API level with the Docker API, as part of like Docker Spawner, or externally outside of the project, you have to configure the rest of what you want through either your manual work or through Ansible to set up the limits and quotas and everything.
Right.
And then the other part is that the usage of our cluster has gone through the roof this quarter, and so I'm quickly entering the zone where I need the ability to scale this across multiple servers. So Docker spawner or an SSH spawner, or I mean something like that. And at that point, I think Docker does make a lot of sense.
Using Swarm?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's interesting. That's a funny thing because basically until 4 months ago, that would specifically exclude Docker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, in this case,
example that everyone references. So.
Yeah. So thanks to Jess for working that out.
Well, and part of what's so weird is that we're seeing a spike in usage of the cluster specifically for interactive jobs, like MATLAB, Python. It's not sort of batch mode, parallel computing stuff. And I just don't know of a good way of scaling that stuff other than Swarm.
Oh, and dumping money into your IT budget. That's the other.
Just buying lots and lots of servers.
But so, yeah, I'm surprised that using something like so when you say interactive jobs, does that mean that you're running Torque or SG or whatever PBS flavor on the cluster now?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so the interactive jobs aren't they're just people SSHing and starting MATLAB. There's no job submission.
There's no job submission, yeah.
Because that's something that batch systems like QSub and SGE also address, is properly assigning services to machines and balancing them based on load.
Yeah, I could do that as well.
And I think that's what the Andrea Zonka, I think, is doing. He's using a conventional HPC batch system to start engines on a cluster, or start servers on a cluster.
For Jupyter Hub?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That would be interesting to see that spawner.
And the main thing that gets you is or the main contribution to Jupyter Hub that came from that was that can take a really long time, an arbitrarily long time to start if your queue is full. So Jupyter Hub does behave correctly if it takes a day to start. It does properly wait up to forever.
Very nice.
For a server to start. With tunable timeouts for, when should I give up and that kind of stuff. Yes, I think it would be interesting to try with Docker. I'm not sure, and Docker may be the simplest way to get to solve those problems. But there are definitely plenty of non-Docker ways to solve those problems.
Yeah.
And for a cluster system, having your own access to, it depends on how much of a managed cluster it is. Right, having access to do all of the module selection stuff. If you've got a real a cluster like the DOE ones or the campus ones that have all these module systems, isolating someone in Docker could be both really beneficial if you want to, like Jess did, set up a really controlled course environment.
Right.
That could be really, really nice to make your users not have to deal with that. But it could also be really inconvenient if your users actually should have access to that. So that should obviously be one of the factors. But I think when a Jupyter Hub instance per course is probably the right way to go. That I don't think a Jupyter Hub instance per institution or even per cluster makes sense.
Yeah. And
then having this is the Docker image for this course, which has these course materials.
Yeah.
Is probably a really useful pattern to have divergent environments.
Yeah.
That one student could have different environments for different courses, and they're allowed to be totally different. And Docker definitely helps with that.
Yeah. One, I'm a little bit scared at this point I think here at Cal Poly, within a year, we could have many, many courses every quarter that want Jupyter Hub. And I have no idea how we'll address that need.
Yeah, that will be interesting.
Exactly. Good way. Yeah.
I think you should campus wide, my opinion, and then let it go hard.
What was that, Kyle? You broke up.
Oh, I said I think you should do it campus wide, not just do it per class. And then, I don't know how you get assignments in there in the same kind of fluid motion that Jess has for the comp models, but.
Oh, I think we've got that mostly solved with NB Grader now. I mean, honestly, the hardest part of all this is the hardware. Like.
Oh, no. So I'm talking about this in files terms according to NFS, right? So if you have it campus-wide and you have multiple courses, does that mean that every instructor has access to the NFS server so that they can give assignments to their students? That's like that's the collaboration component. I'm going to call that collaboration, but I really mean like people stepping on each other.
So, no, the new NB Grader subcommands for release, collect, fetch, and submit all handle that on a shared system that does not make any assumptions about instructors being special users.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So
another thing from the last couple, since we're on Jupyter Hub, from the last couple conferences and kind of generally on the web, is that so people look at the current comp models layout and they're like, wow, this is way more complex than I would ever want to have to deploy.
Yeah.
Certainly going to agree with that. It was, and in a lot of ways, it's really over-provisioned. I'm not really sure what to say there, but I think the hardest issue for us is probably the network storage, which I wish that we could have addressed in a couple different ways. I don't know if there's like a good solution where somebody doesn't have to use NFS, other than Amazon is soon coming out with their elastic file system.
Yeah.
And then the big player that will work across firewalls and other environments is Nasuni. That's a startup that Jesse Noller used to work at. And I'd be really tempted to use one of those, but they're both like locked into a particular vendor.
Yeah.
The Nasuni one is at least good because you can work on different computing environments, and then you don't have to manage NFS yourself. Yeah.
No, that's another issue we're facing as well.
Like I don't know how to make things too much simpler, because like a lot of the parts that are about the complexity are security concerns, like making sure that Nginx is on its own separate host and that the TLS is terminated there. Making sure users running it on a separate machine like than the NFS server itself. Yeah.
No, it all this stuff gets really complex.
Like, it's not like I want to force that on users, but in some ways, like, that's what you have to do if you're deploying this out in the real world. Because we could do it all in one system, right? And you could even launch the Jupyter Hub Docker container and add users, like with like Thomas Wiki's image is actually pretty good. That has like this full Conda install, like the full Anaconda stack, and then you can add users through the GitHub like authenticator thing. But that's not going to scale well. It's going to work well for like one class, but yeah.
So let's we should stop here soon. But Thomas, did you want to comment on the IR kernel release and all that?
Yes, there were a couple of things that I put on the agenda just as like I wanted people to be aware of them. We don't really need much discussion, I expect. IR kernel, we made a release. It's called 0.3. That's just the number we've got to, and it now has like actual R packages and things. They're not on CRAN, because from what I hear, getting packages actually on CRAN is a pain, and I suspect that they're probably not going to like some of the things that I've done. But someone knew about this tool called DRAT, which allows you to build your own R package repository. So there are Windows and OS X binary packages. So it's now easier to install the R kernel. And as Carl knows, Aaron Mura has made Conda packages for that release as well. Yeah, and the other thing was that the kernel test tool that Harry Alamraju, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, made a PR for kind of while we were in the process of getting 3.x out. I have now split out into its own repo and started kind of like reworking it a bit. Min and I thought that the most important thing was for it to have a Python API, so that there's something you can subclass and add your own tests to if you want. So I've made a start on that, and after writing the second test in it, I discovered a bug in IR kernel, so it does work. Yay!
So I at least want to comment on something from the point of Aaron. So we were at PyData Dallas, and the reason we posted to say and ask for a release is that because most people are doing install from GitHub, it just installs straight from master, and that's how our users are currently using it with dev tools. But at least for Aaron, he needed to rely on a release so that he could build the Conda package like he was comfortable with what was there. And they were like, if things got out of line between Repr and IR display and IR kernel, we were seeing really weird behavior.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was always kind of the intention to have real releases at some point. The install from GitHub was just while it was a very young project. You know, it's easier to do that. And I didn't know about DRAT. So
it's like, oh, they didn't accept my package on CRAN. DRAT.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
People seem pretty excited about the R kernel, so that's awesome.
Yeah. So do they have packages on the main Conda channel, or is it still?
So you have to add the R channel. So this is in the Docker file for it right now. Then you just install it.
We might.
They're going to have. You can point your CRAN mirror at binstar on a particular path and get access to all the normal R packages, which also lets you do it over HTTPS. I didn't realize it, but every single CRAN mirror is done over HTTP. I was like, I don't really want to release this then.
So, Thomas, we might want to add the Conda install instructions to the README for the IR kernel as well.
Yeah, I considered that. I'm concerned that the README is already quite long, and I imagine that Conda installing the R kernel will install Conda's own R packages, which I expect probably won't go down terribly well with R users who already have an R setup. So, yeah, in principle, I would. In principle, it totally makes sense to add those instructions, but it's the odd thing of like, I don't want I don't want it to be a tangled forest of different sets of instructions that the user has to try and work out what's the right one for them.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that there should be somewhere where the conda install instructions are obvious. Right, like right now, I don't know that I could find them without pinging Aaron or Kyle. And maybe this is a problem for Aaron to solve with the conda, better documenting all this stuff in conda.
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah. So Aaron has a post on the Continuum blog, preliminary support for R with conda. I think I would like to see that.
the command for
Yes.
the
Command line options look rather bizarre when you have a single letter name. Min's just posted in the hashtag. Yeah, I think I would probably for the moment leave it up to Aaron to make like R packaged in conda a more kind of more prominent and officially well supported thing. I feel like at the moment it's still kind of a bit of an exploratory.
Yeah, I think that's part of why it's in a channel rather than the default repo.
Yeah, that was mine.
Yeah, so they're getting there. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I think it's only going to accelerate now. So.
Okay.
But using channels, and this is maybe something that's not. I guess I don't know how advanced a feature it is, but it's supported at basically every level of conda. The notion of channels. You can sort of get packages from different. They're basically different repositories. And you can do it in a config file to basically activate the R channel all the time, or you can do it on a per command basis, like this example. That -c flag is also look in the R channel.
Mm. Okay.
So it's a way for them to kind of test it out without putting stuff in the default repo or channel, whatever you call it. I don't know.
Hey Kyle, this is a separate thing on the this hold on, let me find it. It is a pull request or an issue. I guess it's an issue on trytojupyter.org that Weevil submitted that has the mock-up of the kernels page.
Oh.
Did everyone see that?
What?
So this is.
Oh, I never clicked the link to mockup here.
Yeah, I just because he spent a lot of time on it and it looks really good. It's basically a mock-up of a page.
Oh, I did look at this before, but I was on my phone, so I had to close it.
It's a mock-up of a page that would be on Jupyter.org that has a really nice description of all the different kernels that we support and links to the documentation.
I don't know what you're referring to. Can you put a link somewhere?
I'll
Yeah,
post
here.
it in the race Brian to post it, I mean.
Ready, go.
It's in the Jitter room.
I posted it on the hackpad.
For long-term usage.
And I think something like this would be a really nice idea. I mean, whether it's this exact design or something like it, I think.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah, instead of the just the wiki page.
Yeah.
You know what? So why don't we just go ahead and create another GitHub pages site that's kernels.jupyter.org with all this. What do people think?
I think eventually we would want it just integrated in the main Jupyter.org website, but
Yeah.
all that once we get going on some of the hires and all of that, we'll have the bandwidth to tackle that. But for now, it's fine to put it under GitHub pages, kernels.jupyter.org.
I'm glad you brought this one up. So at the very least, we should.
Why not just put it on jupyter.org/kernels on the same GitHub pages?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, let's do that.
That seems more easy.
Oh.
There's already a thing there.
Okay, so Kyle, could you follow up with him on that?
Yeah, I'll follow up.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
That's great.
So, do we want to keep going? It's getting real close to noon.
I don't know if anybody has anything brief to say about issue migration. I'm fine with just on the last point of link and delink. I wasn't aware that there was any usage outside widgets. I'm still not sure there is any usage outside widgets that makes sense.
Jess, I told Min about the usage of link in NB Grader.
Yeah, I saw the discussion just before the meeting started. I can explain what I'm doing there.
Yeah,
but
no, but I'm fine. I assumed this was something that basically nobody but Jason and Sylvan were using, since we've never heard from anybody talking about it.
Yeah.
But if it's being used, I'm fine saying, because Sylvan also wants, part of what prompted this was Sylvan wants to change the API for link.
Okay. Well, so
which
maybe
to me says it shouldn't be in traitlets. But if it should be in traitlets, I should say you can't change it.
Well, maybe I can talk to you a bit about what I'm doing, because it's possible that there's a better way to do it. But we could talk about that offline and
Sure.
figure out if it's that I actually need it for that, or if I could replace it with something else.
Yeah, and it may be the simplest way to do what you're doing. So we can. I just wasn't aware of actual things, but yeah, we can look at both of those.
Brian, do you know if Ryan uses it? Ryan might use it.
Yeah, I've used it a couple times outside of widgets for doing sort of building has traits model objects and linking them.
Okay.
But yeah. I understand if Sylvan wants to make a backwards incompatible change, that this definitely comes up.
Yeah, well, and his backwards incompatible change is something that from what I looked at, is not used in, it wouldn't actually break the NB Grader case.
Okay.
He wants to drop the support for multiple targets in one link call, which I think makes sense. I'm surprised it was ever supported.
Okay.
Yeah, we can take that out of the meeting now.
All right. So I guess there's a science fair in Bid, so no meeting next week.
I think it's what a data science.
Oh, a data.
I thought it was at 4 o'clock.
Yeah. So I related to data science fair and Jupyter. One of my students, Jason, now has a Raspberry Pi 2 sitting on top of a quadcopter running the notebook server.
Nice.
And so it controls the quadcopter from Python in the notebook, and you can just connect to the notebook running on the Pi server from your laptop.
That's pretty cool.
Through the Wi-Fi hotspot of the quadcopter.
The next stage for taking over the world plan is IPython-based drones.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, the data science fair is not until after lunch next Tuesday, so it doesn't actually conflict with the meeting, but we may want to be getting ready for it. So we could have a meeting.
Okay. Well,
We might want to take a slightly shorter meeting.
yes.
If we have a need.
All right.
Back to work.
Well, thanks everyone, and have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye. the kernel name, default kernel name for the ARC kernel is IR, right?
Yes. Basically, just because I thought that R was just too short of a thing to be a name.